9 schools stood before the Revolutionary War even had a name, and every one of them was built by a family whose surname is probably sitting in your own inbox right now, on a package label, a work badge, a school pickup list at the end of the day. We think of these colleges as institutions, stone and ivy and endowments too large to count, but in the beginning each one was just a debt owed to a specific man, a specific family, a specific name, that a struggling colonial community needed badly enough to carve into a charter and read aloud at a public meeting. Harvard was a dead minister's library, handed over before the college had a single finished building. Yale was a shipment of goods from a merchant who never once set foot in Connecticut. Brown was a family of Providence traders who could not agree among themselves whether the business that made them rich should be allowed to exist at all. These are not abstract founders standing in a stained glass window. They are surnames, ordinary and specific, and surnames travel. They marry into other families, they get passed down through farms and factories, and finally into you, sitting here, watching this. 9 colonial colleges opened their doors before the United States existed as a country, and each one carries a name that belonged first to a person, not an institution. If your last name is Harvard, Yale, Blair, Dickinson, Livingston, Brown, Rutgers, Franklin, or Wheelock, stay with this one, because the odds that you are hearing your own family's history for the first time tonight are higher than you think, and by the end you will know exactly which debt your name once settled. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Most of these families never set out to found anything permanent. They were paying off a favor, honoring a dead relative, or simply trying to keep a fragile local project from collapsing under its own unpaid bills, and the naming that followed was as much accident as intention. A trustee's vote taken in a single evening that then outlived every person in the room by centuries. What ties all 9 of these stories together is not wealth in the way we picture it today. Several of these founding gifts were modest even by colonial standards: a shipment of trade goods, a personal library, a church bell. What separated these particular families from the hundreds of others who could have given something similar was timing, and the willingness to answer when a struggling school needed exactly what they had to offer, at exactly the moment it needed it most, before the doors closed for good, and the whole project became just another failed colonial venture nobody remembered by the following generation. Before the countdown, a little more context on how 9 colonial colleges came to exist at all, and why the pattern repeats itself so precisely across a century and a half. Massachusetts Bay Colony was not yet 20 years old in 1636. Most of its founding ministers were already old men, dying of fever or exhaustion or the simple math of 17th century life expectancy, and the general court understood a hard truth early. A colony without a steady supply of trained clergy would not survive as a religious project, no matter how much land it claimed or how many ships arrived each spring. So the colony voted money toward a school before it had students, a campus, a president, or even a settled name for the place. That single decision set a pattern that repeated itself, almost mechanically, for the next 133 years. A denomination needed ministers it could trust. A colony needed lawyers who understood English common law instead of guessing at it. A frontier needed doctors who had actually opened a medical text rather than learned by trial and funeral. 9 schools rose out of that need between 1636 and 1769, chartered under English kings who mostly never thought about them again, funded by merchants who wanted their names remembered longer than their ledgers, and titled, almost every single time, after the person who paid the bill at the exact moment the project was about to fail. Some of these men never taught a class, some never saw the finished buildings, a few never crossed the ocean to visit what they had funded. By the time the last of these 9 schools opened its doors in 1769, the pattern was so well established that colonial newspapers barely remarked on it anymore. A new charter, a new board of trustees, a new name carved above a new doorway, and somewhere behind every single one of them, a family ledger that had just been quietly settled. Some of these colleges started with royal charters and the full weight of the crown behind them. Others started as barely legal workarounds, congregations and denominations building schools their colonial governments had never explicitly authorized, and hoping no one in London noticed until the buildings were already standing. What follows is the roll call of those names, in the order their debts came due, and the specific families still carrying them today, scattered now across every state in the country, most of them with no idea their own surname once saved a university from closing its doors for good, or that a stranger 300 years back once wrote a check, a will, or a will's single clause that quietly changed how a whole country would eventually educate itself. Number 9, Rutgers. Queens College opened its doors in New Jersey in 1766. chartered by the colony's Dutch Reformed congregations who wanted a school close to home instead of sending their sons across the Atlantic to study theology in the Netherlands, a journey that could take 2 months each way and cost more than most farming families ever saw in cash. For nearly 6 decades, the college survived on almost nothing, closing its classes more than once for lack of money, sometimes for years at a stretch, until a Revolutionary War veteran named Colonel Henry Rutgers stepped in at exactly the right moment. Rutgers had commanded a militia regiment at the Battle of Long Island, watched much of his family's Manhattan farmland get seized and occupied by British troops during the war, and rebuilt his fortune afterward through New York City real estate as the city expanded north across the island. In 1825, he gave the failing college a church bell, a bond worth $5,000, and permission to carry his name into the future. The surname itself is Dutch, a patronymic built from Rutger, the old Low Countries form of Roger, meaning something close to fame and spear joined together as one word. Dutch Rutgers families settled thick through the Hudson Valley and northern New Jersey during the 1600s, arriving as farmers, millers, and small merchants, and the name is still concentrated in exactly those same counties today. 3 centuries after the first Rutgers stepped off a boat in New Amsterdam with almost nothing, and built, generation by generation, patient acre by patient acre, the fortune that would eventually save a college he never attended a single day of class at. Henry Rutgers himself never married and left no children of his own, so the surname that carries the college forward today survives only through his brothers and cousins, scattered across the same stretch of New York and New Jersey their Dutch ancestors first settled 2 centuries earlier, farming the same river bottomland their family had cleared long before there was a United States to belong to. Queens College itself changed its name more than once, before Rutgers finally stuck, and for a stretch in the early 1800s it closed entirely, its handful of remaining students sent home, its charter kept alive on paper alone until enough money could be found to reopen the doors a second time. Number 8. Brown. Rhode Island College opened in 1764 under a Baptist charter, the first American college that did not require students to belong to any specific denomination to attend, an idea considered dangerously liberal by nearly every other colonial institution at the time. Its first president, James Manning, ran the school out of a rented tavern room for years while he traveled Providence begging merchants for enough money to put up a permanent building. The merchant family that finally answered, the Browns, gave enough in 1794 that the grateful trustees renamed the school Brown University on the spot. What the college rarely advertised in its own early histories is that the Brown family's fortune came from more than one source, and not all of it was clean by any measure, then or now. Some Browns financed slaving voyages that sailed directly out of Providence Harbor, ships that carried human cargo across the Atlantic for profit like any other commodity. One brother in that same family, Moses Brown, became a devout Quaker in midlife and spent the second half of his years fighting to abolish the very trade that had helped build the fortune he was born into, funding some of the earliest organized abolitionist efforts in New England. The surname Brown is one of the oldest descriptive names in the English language, simply meaning brown-haired or brown-complexioned, and it arrived in America by every possible route at once, English, Scottish, and Ulster alike, which is part of why it remains one of the most common surnames in the entire country to this day, carried by millions who share nothing but a color and an accident of medieval description. What makes the Providence Browns different from every other Brown family in America is not the name itself, but the paper trail left behind. Ledgers and shipping manifests and family letters preserved in Rhode Island archives that let historians trace, almost voyage by voyage, exactly how the family fortune was made, and exactly which brother objected and when, a level of documented family conflict that most colonial families never left any record of at all, disagreements that played out in real letters between real brothers rather than being smoothed over and forgotten the way most family arguments from that era simply were. Number 7. Livingston, the name most closely tied to King's College in New York, chartered by George II in 1754 and renamed Columbia after independence, severed the colony from its royal charter language. The Livingstons were not the college's founders in the direct way Henry Rutgers or the Brown family were, but William Livingston led the political fight against the Anglican Church's attempt to control the new school entirely, arguing loudly and in print for a non-sectarian board of trustees representing the colony's full range of denominations. He mostly lost that specific fight at the time, watching the Anglican faction secure control of the presidency anyway, but the argument he made shaped how American colleges were governed for the next 2 centuries, long after his own defeat was forgotten by everyone but historians. The Livingston name is Scottish, drawn from a place name in West Lothian near Edinburgh, and the family that carried it into the Hudson Valley in the 1670s became one of the largest landholding dynasties in colonial New York, holding a single manor of more than 160,000 acres stretched along the river's eastern bank. If your family tree runs through the Hudson Valley Dutch and English gentry, or through New Jersey and New York politics in the Revolutionary generation, the Livingston name is one worth tracing all the way back to that original Scottish grant. The manor itself stayed in Livingston hands for generations, divided and subdivided among descendants as the family grew, and by the time of the Revolution, the name had spread far enough beyond the manor walls that Livingston served in the Continental Congress, signed state constitutions, and sat on the New York bench, all while the family that started it all in West Lothian had long since scattered into branches that barely knew of each other's existence. King's College itself briefly closed during the Revolutionary War, its building used as a military hospital while cannon fire echoed across the harbor, before reopening under the new name that has carried it ever since. Number 6. Franklin. Though the College of Philadelphia never carried his name the way the others carried theirs, a fact that says something about the man himself. Benjamin Franklin proposed the school in 1749, in a widely circulated pamphlet arguing that Pennsylvania's youth needed practical education, not just Latin, Greek, and theology, a genuinely radical idea in a colonial world built almost entirely around training ministers for the pulpit. Franklin raised the money door to door among Philadelphia's merchants, sat on the first board of trustees himself, and pushed a curriculum built around English composition, modern history, and useful science, decades before any other American college considered practical study worth a formal place in the classroom. The surname Franklin is not a family name in the usual inherited sense at all. It comes from Middle English, Franklin, meaning a free landholder, a man who owned his own ground outright and answered to no feudal lord above him, ranked just below the gentry but firmly above the common tenant farmer in medieval England's rigid social ladder. Families who carried the name into the American colonies were, almost by definition of the word itself, descended from that specific class of free small landowners, and the surname spread widely enough by the 1700s that Franklins could be found from the hill towns of New England all the way to the Carolina backcountry, every one of them tracing back to some anonymous medieval ancestor who, centuries earlier, held ground that belonged entirely to him and no one else. Benjamin Franklin's own branch of the name traced back to a long line of blacksmiths and dyers in Northamptonshire before his father crossed the Atlantic as a candle maker, a trade Franklin himself walked away from as a teenager, and there is a certain fitting irony in the fact that a surname built on the idea of owning one's own ground ended up attached to a school built on the idea that a mind, not land, was the surest thing a free man could own outright. The school he built would go through its own identity crisis over the following century, shifting between charity school, college, and university status more than once, until it finally settled into the shape and the name it has carried since the 1800s. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Number 5. Dickinson. The College of New Jersey, the school that would eventually become Princeton, was founded in 1746 by a small group of evangelical Presbyterian ministers swept up in the religious fervor of the Great Awakening, and its very first classes met inside the parsonage of its first president, Jonathan Dickinson, in the quiet town of Elizabethtown. Dickinson died within 5 months of the college opening its doors, a sudden loss that nearly ended the entire project before it had produced a single graduate, and the school moved first to Newark and then finally to Princeton under the leadership of the men who came after him. The Dickinson surname is English, a patronymic built from Dickon, an old medieval diminutive of Richard, meaning simply son of Dickon. It has no single point of origin since it sprang up independently in villages scattered across the English Midlands wherever a local man named Dickon happened to have a son who needed a surname of his own, and it crossed the Atlantic in dozens of entirely unrelated founding families throughout the 17th century. Somewhere among the Dickinsons scattered across New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and later the broader Midwest as the country pushed west, there is very likely a line running directly back to the small parsonage where an American university held its first and most fragile class. The Dickinson name would attach itself to American education a second time decades later, when a different branch of the family lent its name to a college in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. A coincidence of shared surname rather than shared blood that genealogists still have to untangle carefully whenever a family claims descent from one Dickinson founder or the other. The Elizabethtown Parsonage, where the first classes met, no longer stands, but the town itself kept careful records of the ministers who passed through it, records that still let researchers trace exactly which families sat in those first cramped classes alongside Dickinson's own children. Number 4. Blair. The College of William and Mary was chartered in 1693, the second oldest college in British North America after Harvard, and it exists at all because of one relentless Scottish clergyman named James Blair, who simply refused to give up. Blair sailed to Virginia in 1685 as a missionary for the Anglican Church, spent 8 patient years lobbying the Crown and the Virginia legislature for a proper college charter, and eventually traveled to London himself to secure it directly from King William and Queen Mary, rather than trust the process to colonial agents. He then served as the college's president for exactly 50 years, longer than any other head of an American university before or since, outlasting several colonial governors and at least one entire English monarch. The surname Blair comes from Scottish Gaelic blar, meaning a plain or a battlefield, a description of open, cleared ground, and it is thick across the lowlands of Scotland and across Ulster, carried into Ireland by the Scottish settlement movements of the 1600s. Blair families reached Virginia and the Carolinas in wave after wave through the 1700s, most of them Presbyterian dissenters rather than Anglicans, most of them tracing back to exactly the same lowland Scots and Scots-Irish migration corridor that put James Blair himself on a ship bound for the Chesapeake in the first place. Blair never returned to Scotland after sailing for Virginia, married into a prominent local family once he arrived, and spent his final decades as one of the most powerful men in the colony, a founder whose surname now sits carved into buildings that generations of his own descendants walked past without ever fully knowing why. Blair also helped found the college's grammar school, a preparatory branch meant to feed students directly into the college itself, a structure other colonial schools would later copy once they saw how well it worked in Virginia. Number 3. Yale. The collegiate school opened in Connecticut in 1701, founded by 10 Congregationalist ministers who each personally donated a stack of books to start its library, and for its first 15 years the school had no permanent home at all, moving between towns and barely surviving on donated grain and firewood. In 1718, a Boston-born merchant named Elihu Yale, who had spent decades running the East India Company's operations out of Madras and had never once visited Connecticut in his entire life, sent the struggling school a shipment of trade goods that sold for well over £200, along with a stack of books and a formal portrait of King George I. It was, by the standards of the era's great fortunes, a genuinely modest gift, nowhere close to the largest donation the school had ever hoped for, but it arrived at the exact desperate moment the school needed it most, and the trustees renamed the college in his honor before the ink on the sale receipts had even fully dried. The surname Yale is Welsh, not English, drawn from Ial, an Old Welsh word for a fertile upland or moorland region, tied specifically to Denbighshire, once a Welsh marcher lordship carrying that same name centuries before any Yale crossed an ocean. Elihu Yale's own family had left Wales generations before his birth, which means the university most associated with old American money and old American power carries a name that began, quietly, in the hill country of North Wales. Elihu Yale died in England in 1721, was buried in the churchyard of the parish where his own family had lived for generations, and never learned that a handful of trade goods sent almost as an afterthought would end up outlasting his own name far more thoroughly than anything else he accomplished during 4 decades running an empire's trading post half a world away from Wales, Boston, or Connecticut alike. The 10 founding ministers who actually built the school with their own donated books rarely get mentioned in the same breath as the man whose name it carries, a familiar pattern in this particular kind of history, where the last gift often gets remembered longer than the first 10. Number 2, Wheelock, and this one carries a weight the other names on this list do not. Dartmouth College opened in 1769 under the direction of Congregationalist minister Eleazar Wheelock, but the money that made the school possible was not raised for a college at all in the beginning. It was raised specifically for a school to educate Native American youth, and it was raised in large part by a Mohegan Presbyterian minister named Samson Occom, who traveled to England in 1766 and spent nearly 2 full years preaching in churches across the country to raise funds for exactly that mission. Occom brought back more than £12,000 sterling, an enormous sum for the period, larger than almost any charitable collection raised in the colonies up to that point. Wheelock used the money to found Dartmouth in New Hampshire, hundreds of miles from most of the native communities the funds had originally been raised to serve, and the college's enrollment of native students remained small for generations, while its enrollment of the sons of white colonial families grew steadily larger every year. Occom felt the redirection of his own fundraising work as a personal betrayal and said so plainly, in his own handwriting, before he died. The Wheelock surname is English, most likely topographic in origin, describing a family that once lived near a bend or wheel-shaped curve in a stream or river, and it remains rare enough today that most people who still carry it can trace directly back to the small handful of Wheelock households recorded in colonial New England parish registers. Samson Occom's own descendants, by contrast, carry a name that never made it onto any campus building, though Dartmouth would spend more than 2 centuries slowly reckoning with the gap between the mission it was funded to carry out and the college it actually became, a reckoning that is still visible today in how the school talks about its own founding. Eleazar Wheelock's own sons continued running the college after his death, keeping the presidency inside the family for a second generation, a rare enough arrangement among these 9 schools that it stands out on its own even without the Occom story layered underneath it. Number 1. Harvard, older than the other 8 schools on this list combined, and the reason the word college entered the American vocabulary the way it eventually did. The Massachusetts Bay General Court voted money toward a school in 1636, before the school had a building, a president, or a single enrolled student to its name. 2 years later, a young Puritan minister named John Harvard, who had emigrated from London only the year before with his new wife, died suddenly of tuberculosis at the age of 30, having lived in the colony barely 12 months from arrival to burial. In his will, he left the fledgling school half of his entire estate and his personal library of roughly 400 books, more printed volumes than existed anywhere else in New England combined at that moment. The General Court voted to name the college after him within months of his death, a decision made quickly and almost out of gratitude rather than ceremony. He never saw a single class held inside a finished building. The surname Harvard is old, and its exact origin is still debated even among specialists today, most likely Old English, possibly built from words meaning army and guardian joined together, though some genealogists trace it instead to a Norfolk place name tied to herding boars across common land. What is certain, whatever the surname once meant, is that the man who gave it to American higher education never intended to found anything at all. He simply died young, with no children, a full personal library, and enough money left over that a struggling young colony chose to spend the next 4 centuries saying his name out loud, in one form or another, every single day. John Harvard's widow remarried within 2 years of his death and left no children behind from either marriage, which means every Harvard walking around America today, however many there are, descends from some entirely separate branch of the surname, unrelated by blood to the minister whose short life and long library gave the word college its most famous American meaning. His original 400 books burned in a fire in the college library in 1764, all but a single volume that happened to be checked out by a student at the time, which means almost nothing physical from John Harvard's own hands survives today, only the name, still doing the work he left it to do. 9 names, 9 schools, and underneath every one of them, a family that either had the money at exactly the right desperate moment, or simply refused to let a fragile idea collapse before it had a chance to prove itself. Somewhere in the counties of New Jersey, the hill towns of New England, the manor lands of the Hudson Valley, or the Scots-Irish backcountry of Virginia and the Carolinas, these 9 surnames kept moving long after the first buildings went up, marrying into other family lines, spreading into trades and professions that had nothing to do with education at all, showing up eventually on mailboxes their own founding ancestors could never have imagined or predicted. If one of these 9 names sits anywhere in your own family tree, the paper trail worth following runs through old church records, county land deeds, probate files, and college archives that many of these same schools still keep open to descendants who come looking, sometimes with far more detail preserved than most families expect. The names outlasted the men who carried them first into these stories. In American history, that is usually how it works. A surname given to a struggling school in a single evening of gratitude 2 or 3 centuries ago rarely stays contained to that one purpose for long. It moves into hospitals and law firms and small towns named after distant cousins. It shows up on street signs in cities the original founder never visited, and it keeps traveling quietly through marriage records and census pages until the connection back to that first act of generosity, or desperation, or simple timing is something only a determined descendant with a few free weekends and a library card is ever likely to rediscover. 9 names carried forward by millions of people who have never once thought to ask why a university sounds exactly like their own last name, why a street in a town they have never visited carries the same 6 letters as the one on their own front door, or why a name on a diploma their grandparents kept framed in a hallway once belonged, first, to somebody who simply refused to watch a fragile idea die for lack of a signature. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.